It's such a great honor to be here, and I'm so grateful to Dr. Schoenfeld, and it's such a pleasure to see Dr. Rose again. He's been instrumental in all the work that I've done, and I'm really very appreciative. I am here as a science journalist and not as a researcher, and I have spent about the last 5 years looking into the issue of autoimmune disease. About 5 years ago, I set out to write a book looking at whether or not we were facing rising rates of autoimmune disease. And I wanted to know if indeed we were facing rising rates of autoimmune disease, what indeed would be the reasons for this increase. I want to tell you that my personal reasons for investigating this are fairly complicated. I'll start with the fact that I was in my very early 40s and not so young when I found myself in Johns Hopkins Hospital, and I was paralyzed for the second time with an autoimmune disease known as Guillain-Barré syndrome. And while I laid in the hospital, I had 2 young children at home. I had a journalism career, a book writing career, magazine deadlines. I couldn't drive a car. I couldn't tie my kids' shoes. I couldn't type a word. Moreover, I found myself in the same hospital as my father, who had died at the age of 42 from what we would almost certainly now diagnose as autoimmune diseases. But what was so interesting to me was that in the 1970s, when my father died, we wouldn't have classified the diseases that he had as autoimmune in nature because we simply didn't know that autoimmune diseases really existed or what they were or what was causing them. And the reasons for this are kind of complicated. And I will tell you one other thing from a personal perspective. What drove me was I grew up as the granddaughter of a well-known researcher. My grandfather had been head of cancer research at NIH. When I was growing up, it was nothing to hear about his travels all around the world, where he was gathering information and giving money to researchers behind the Iron Curtain and everywhere to try to forward the research in cancer. So here I was. My father had died early. I was facing an unmitigated, set of autoimmune diseases, and I couldn't figure out why didn't we know anything about them. So I did a little research, and it turned out that in the 1950s, and I'm sure many of you know the story of actually, and it is Noel who taught me this story, so thank you, that in the early 1950s, the accepted mantra of medicine, as put forth by the very charismatic Nobel Prize winner Paul Ehrlich, was horror autotoxicus. The body could not and would not turn on itself. And this remained accepted science throughout the first half of the 20th century. However, in 1957, there was a young postdoc by the name of Noel Rose at the University of Buffalo who discovered autoimmunity by accident when he found that the rabbits in his labs were developing antibodies that were attacking their own thyroids. But this idea ran completely against accepted medical doctrine. And even after this discovery, the idea that autoimmune diseases could exist and that the body could turn on itself was really not widely accepted until the 1970s and late in the 1970s. Meanwhile, medical schools continued to turn out specialists with the idea of horror autotoxicus. And it was a perfect case of something we science journalists refer to as what Thomas Kuhn once called normal science. Whenever there's a new paradigm in science, it takes about 20 years for it to trickle down and to be incorporated into widespread practice. So it wasn't until the mid-1980s that autoimmune disease was widely taught in medical school, and as any patient can tell you, it's still impossible to find, quote-unquote, an autoimmune doctor. But even so, by then, different specialists had claimed different sets of diseases for their own. For instance, the neurologists were working with the patients with Guillain-Barré and MS, and the rheumatologists were working with lupus and scleroderma. And no one was standing at the mountaintop, kind of looking at all these diseases and figuring out what multiple pathways might be. So it's until very recently that autoimmunity remained the black box of modern science. So the statistics vary. NIH uses a number of 24 million Americans who suffer from an autoimmune disease. ARDA, the American Association of Autoimmune and Related Disorders, it estimates 50 million Americans, and I have to say, I think from the thousands of patients I hear from, I think ARDA is right. We know that 75% of those who suffer from an autoimmune disease are women. We know that a woman is 8 times more likely to have an autoimmune disease than breast cancer. And we also know that autoimmune disease afflicts more than double the number of people who suffer from cancer and more than the number of people who suffer from heart disease. So here's a broad brush ratio visual. If you look on the left, men who have cancer, women who have cancer in blue. In the middle, the red, men who have coronary heart disease versus women. And then the ratio of men who have autoimmune disease to women who have autoimmune disease in yellow. And here's just a quick visual for you for the number of people having any of these 3 big diseases at any given point in time. So we can see cancer in blue, coronary heart disease in red, and we can see autoimmune disease again in yellow. So as I set out to do research on this growing tide of autoimmune diseases, I started to look at a number of studies. And as I did, researchers would tell me that, by and large, autoimmunity seemed to be what they refer to as the Western disease. And we looked at about 16 peer-reviewed journals reporting rising rates of lupus, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, thyroiditis, scleroderma, Crohn's disease, Addison's disease, and polymyositis in developed industrialized countries around the world. Certain studies were particularly daunting. The Mayo Clinic has recently reported rates of rheumatoid arthritis in women have increased 50% in the past decade. Rates of type 1 diabetes have increased 5-fold over the past several decades. And the real heartbreaker for me, because I hear from so many of the parents of these children, is that in children 4 and under, the rate of type 1 diabetes is increasing at 6% a year. And sadly, for these patients, most of them see 4 doctors over a period of 4 years before they receive an accurate diagnosis. So what I set out to ask as I began my research for my book was, if the rates were rising, and it turned out that they were, what was behind this rising tide of autoimmune disease? We know, of course, researchers will tell journalists that the chances of developing an autoimmune disease are about 30% genetic and about 70% environmental. So obviously in my own family, there was a strong genetic predisposition to autoimmunity. However, what in the environment might be tipping a number of us toward an autoimmune response? And as I went around and followed researchers who let me go in their labs and ask endless questions, it seemed a confluence of factors were creating a perfect storm, allowing this autoimmune epidemic to take hold. The chemicals and pollutants in our environment, our modern diet, the levels of stress we live with, of course, viral and bacterial infections, and then also we'll talk just a minute about the hygiene hypothesis. So clearly, while genetics might load the gun, it was the environment that was pulling the trigger. So I want to share this quote from someone who's a dear friend of mine at Johns Hopkins. He helped me to understand in broad brush strokes, in between saving my life from Guillain-Barré syndrome and a few other autoimmune diseases, why he believed this autoimmune epidemic was taking place. And this is from Ahmed Hoke, who is director of the neuromuscular division at Johns Hopkins Medical Institution. It takes the human body thousands of years to adapt to new environmental stresses. Yet in 100 years, we've dumped so many toxic substances into our environment that our immune system is being asked to differentiate between our own body and unrecognizable invaders nonstop, which makes our body much more likely to make a mistake than, say, a century ago. There are just so many more opportunities to make mistakes. And here I'm going to share something that Noel said to me early on and helped direct my research as well. We have no other good explanation as to why there should be an increase in autoimmune diseases except for the things to which we are exposed in the environment. Autoimmunity is our immune system's effort to adapt to all the new environmental agents and shifts that we're being bombarded with. It's an unsuccessful adaptation, but it's our body's way of trying to fight back. So what are we fighting back against? I don't know how many of you are familiar in the U.S. with a lot of work going on with something called the body burden. The CDC has been looking for a long time, in the last almost 10 years, at 2,500 Americans from whom they took a great number of blood samples, looking for the body burden, or the amount of chemicals and pollutants that each individual was carrying. And they found traces of all 190 pollutants they looked for, including BPA, phthalates, PFOAs, which are a breakdown of Teflon, PBDs, which are flame retardants, PCBs, insecticides, dioxin, mercury. One particularly disturbing study was in 2005. Samples were taken by the American Red Cross of newborn infants' fetal cord blood, and they found a cocktail of 287 industrial pollutants. What do we know? We know that PFOA can be found in blood samples of 96% of people in the U.S. We know that levels of PBDs are doubling in people every 2 to 5 years. We know that 21% of American women of childbearing age have mercury levels higher than the EPA's safety limit. And we know that 25% of people who are adults living in New York have elevated blood mercury levels. So I want to explain this cartoon a little bit. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but I'll run through it. It's a favorite among, science journalists. We call it spinning the wheel. And I show this to you because one has to be very cautious about relating any given exposure to disease risk. This cartoon is called Today's Random Medical News, and it says, according to a report released today, and you can spin the wheel, and you can fill in, red wine causes hypothermia in men 25 to 40. And I share this with you because I want you to know I don't take lightly looking at this idea of what different environmental triggers might result in any given disease in any person at any given time. Of course, we know a great deal from animal studies, and I'll run through these fairly quickly. Mice exposed to even low doses of certain chemicals and heavy metals at rates comparable to what the EPA deems safe in humans are more susceptible to developing autoimmune dysfunction and autoimmune disease such as lupus and autoimmune hepatitis. We see studies in pesticides, PFOA, which is found in virtually everything we use: nonstick cookware, car parts, flooring, computer chips. My favorite is the disposable coffee cups at Starbucks. And trichloroethylene, or TCE, which is chemical found in dry cleaning, paint thinners, glues, and adhesives. And animal models also show us that heavy metals can trigger autoimmune disease. We know that mice exposed to inorganic mercury at levels analogous to those found in healthy people's kidneys develop lupus more quickly than control mice. So in humans, the studies are a little more upsetting and disturbing because we're the guinea pigs. We know that individuals with higher concentrations of PFOA in their blood have higher rates of thyroid disease. And we know from epidemiological evidence that endocrine disruptors such as BPA, which again is in almost everything, safety helmets, dental sealants, eyeglass lenses, and all the food packaging, impact the function of the immune system in ways that promote development of type 1 diabetes in children. In 2007, researchers studied data from 300,000 death certificates in 26 states over a 14-year period. And they found that those working with pesticides, textiles, solvents, which contain TCE, and asbestos were more likely to die from lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, or scleroderma. And in metal studies, the higher the average levels of heavy metals, the higher one's likelihood of scleroderma. And severely affected scleroderma patients have higher levels of mercury in their urine than do healthy patients. So going back to my cartoon, or my science journalist cartoon, of how hard it is to relate any given exposure to any given disease at any given time in any individual, it's particularly difficult with these diseases because autoimmune diseases are long, slow-brewing conditions that quietly smolder in the body, often for a decade or more, before there are signs of disease. And moreover, it's difficult to find any kind of definitive evidence of causality because it may not be any one trigger at any given time. It may be a combination of things that are filling the barrel, so to speak, until the barrel spills over. Meanwhile, it's not as if chemical companies and industry is changing anything that it does. Today, 80,000 chemicals are registered for use in the U.S., and the EPA approves about 1,700 to 2,000 more each year, an average of 5 a day, without testing as to whether or not they pose a challenge to the human immune system. So I often think we talk about the carbon imprint that we're leaving on our planet, but we really don't think very much about the chemical imprint that we're leaving in our bodies. So I also, in the course of researching my book, looked at diet. And it was staggering to find that our modern processed food diet also seems to be contributing to today's perfect storm of factors and the autoimmune epidemic. In the past half century, we all know we've undergone radical shifts toward a more processed food diet, and it's changed the microflora of our intestinal tracts. Certainly, where I come from, America, half of the calories eaten by any American come from man-made, non-whole foods that are packaged breads, chips, cookies, sweets, crackers. And as that microflora changes and unhealthy bacteria proliferate, the immune system is becoming increasingly reactive. We know that celiac disease, for example, is 4 times more common today than it was 50 years ago. We also know that studies show that diet makes a difference. When South Asian immigrants move to Western countries and consume our processed food diets, they're more likely to develop Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. We also know that eating a whole foods anti-inflammatory or Mediterranean diet, I can't help but think of all the olives around us right now, reduces the risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis. And we know that children who eat a whole foods diet have a lower risk of developing Crohn's, while those who eat a processed food diet face a higher risk. And yet, most autoimmune patients report that their doctor never mentions diet to them. And a recent study of GI fellows studying at top medical institutions in the US found that 70% had never had an inpatient rotation in nutrition. Yet these were subspecialty doctors who were going on to practice and treat digestive-related diseases. They were going on to be GI specialists at America's top hospitals. So one of the other areas I looked into in my research was the stress factor. We know a great deal about what stress does to the immune system, and some of the more interesting findings here are that those experiencing ongoing stress have higher levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Patients who suffered the loss of a child are 50% more likely to develop MS than those who've never gone through such a trauma. And those who've experienced trauma in childhood are more likely to develop chronic fatigue, a range of other illnesses as well. Stress works as a toxin, taxing our immune system in a way that's similar to what happens when we're infected by a virus or bacteria. And of course, viral and bacterial infections play a role in triggering autoimmune disease. Certainly in my own case, in Guillain-Barré, infection played a significant role, and also in type 1 diabetes. Vaccine adjuvants are linked to autoimmunity, and hepatitis B vaccine and others have been linked to lupus. So just a word here, as a researcher, whenever you set out as a science journalist with an idea, you're usually told your idea is wrong and that there's another explanation for what you're seeing or thinking. And probably the thing that I've heard most in the last 5 years is that there's no rising epidemic except for the fact that instead of the world that we're living in being too dirty, the world that we're living in is too clean, the hygiene hypothesis. And that argues that childhoods are spent in well-vacuumed homes, in minivans, rather than mucking about in the backyard and in the dirt. And the cleaner environment that we have is leaving our immune system undereducated. So the way that I think about it is it's as if our immune systems are overreactive to stimuli, kind of like bored teenagers who are just looking for something to do. But is that really the whole story? Because at the same time that we're living with fewer exposures to natural pathogens and spending less time mucking around in the backyard dirt, we're coming into contact with many more times artificial invaders. And that well-vacuumed carpet is full of flame retardants, and the minivan is full of plasticizers and PBDs and PFOAs. One recent EPA study found that the fumes and gases that are released into our homes by everyday cleaners contribute to making indoor air 5 times more polluted than the air that we breathe outside. And this is true even in New York City and in LA, where we tend to think of the outside air being pretty bad. So here are some reasons why I believe the hygiene hypothesis doesn't fully explain today's autoimmune epidemic. And I also want to credit my friend Elisa Fairweather at Johns Hopkins for helping me to put some of this together. At the same time that our immune systems are confronted with less dirt and muck and deadly outbreaks of disease, we're encountering a slew of artificial toxins that confuse and overtax our immune systems. We know that immigrants from non-industrialized countries develop allergies and asthma at rates that are as high as those in industrialized Western countries soon after they move here. And that means more is at play here than whether we did or did not have exposure to dirt and worms and childhood diseases. So what do? I usually speak to patient groups, and usually they're really a frustrated group. And I was saying to people last night that it would be so great if they could see you all gathered here today, because so often after 4 years of searching for a diagnosis and still not knowing what's wrong, they can't imagine that this many gifted people have gathered to come together and find answers for them. They feel disenfranchised. And often, while they're waiting for answers or the right medication or the cure, they look for simple things they can do in their own lives right now, today, before another day goes by. And simple things come to mind. Of course, we can control what we buy. We can go green with natural cleaning agents. Certainly, cosmetics play an enormous role, choosing cosmetics made by corporations that have eliminated parabens and phthalates, which, like BPA, are known endocrine disruptors. And we know that specific ingredients found in cosmetics are linked to autoimmunity and perhaps play a role in the higher rate of autoimmunity that women suffer. One thing I encourage all the women in the audience to do is check out the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics. And of course, changing our diet to a more whole foods Mediterranean diet makes a tremendous difference as well. And I hear these stories from patients every day. I changed my diet, I got rid of a lot of these things, and disease doesn't go into remission, but they feel better. They're not as sick quite as often. But one of the most important things we can do right in the moment is to also manage our moment-to-moment stress levels. So bringing down the stress levels makes a tremendous difference, and we're seeing a lot of interesting studies coming out on meditation, yoga, laughter yoga, and different things which help to bring down disease activity. I just want to also say that regardless of all this, autoimmune disease still seems to be an orphan epidemic. The NIH still gives 10 times more money to cancer than to autoimmune disease. And here's a visual of how that funding breaks down. And I'd also like to encourage everyone to adopt one new word in their vocabulary. It is frustrating that although we've had the word carcinogen for a very long time to refer to the idea that there could be environmental triggers that lead to cancer, we don't really have a good word to refer to the idea that toxins or viruses or heavy metals or infections could lead to autoimmune disease. And I would propose the word autogen for that purpose. So my goal would be to help place autoimmune disease on par with cancer and heart disease and treat these as the big three so that we can come together to prevent and cure. And I just have as one last visual here a list of all the different autoimmune diseases. It seems almost everything is autoimmune. We know arteriosclerosis and now Alzheimer's, autism, Lyme disease, fibromyalgia, and chronic fatigue possibly are all going to be added to this list, which I've put together just as a visual for how many diseases all of you have gathered here to help treat and combat. And it goes on and on. And then I'm just leaving you with that last picture, and that's my father. And I began a lot of this research for him because I think all of the research that you all are doing here today, he would still be alive if he had the good work of all of you. So thank you very much.